The morning sun fell warm across the Harrison ranch, but the windows of the grand house remained closed. Thomas Harrison sat at the breakfast table watching his daughter Emma fold her napkin into precise squares. She hadn't spoken yet today. She rarely spoke anymore. A year had passed since Sarah died. A year of silence gathering like dust. Emma was 8 years old and moved through the house like a ghost haunting her own life. Bendoing daddy ba estan ansa. Her small hands worked the napkin methodically fold, crease, smooth. Thomas watched her the way a man watches something precious slipping through his fingers. The breakfast came on trays from the bunkhouse cook. The kitchen in the main house sat unused, pristine as a museum, Sarah's domain, untouched since the funeral. Thomas noticed the music box on the shelf. Sarah had given it to Emma for her 7th birthday. It hadn't been opened in 12 months. Outside, ranch hands laughed as they headed toward the stables. The sound drifted through the closed windows, muffled and distant. Thomas saw Emma's eyes flick toward the noise, then drop back to her plate. She'd forgotten how to laugh. He'd watched it happen slowly. Watched joy drain from her like water from a cracked vessel. First the smiles faded. Then the questions stopped. Then the humming while she played. Now there was only this terrible, careful silence. Thomas set down his coffee cup. The clink seemed loud in the quiet room. "Emma," he said gently. She looked up. Those were Sarah's eyes looking back at him, but empty of light. "I'm thinking of hiring someone to help around the house," he said. "Someone to cook and keep things running proper. Would that be all right with you?" Emma nodded once, then returned to her breakfast. No curiosity. No questions about who or when or why, just acceptance, as if nothing mattered anymore. Thomas's chest tightened. He was a wealthy man who could buy his daughter anything, except the one thing she needed. The sound of her own laughter. He pushed back from the table and walked to the window. Spring had come to the valley despite their grief. Green spreading across the hills, wildflowers dotting the meadows, life insisting on itself. His foreman was crossing the yard. Thomas opened the window the first time in months and called down. "Hi, Hank. Spread the word I'm hiring household help. Someone to cook and manage the house." "Yes, sir," Hank called back. "Any particular requirements?" Thomas hesitated. How did you ask for what he needed? How did you put that into words? "Someone with a kind heart," he said finally. "Someone who remembers how to smile." Hank tipped his hat, understanding more than Thomas had said. The foreman had watched Emma fade too. Thomas closed the window but didn't latch it. "Because," a crack of fresh air slipped into the room, carrying the scent of warming earth and growing things. Behind him, Emma had finished her breakfast and was stacking her dishes with the same methodical care she brought to everything now. No mess, no mistakes, no joy. Thomas made himself a promise. Whatever it took, whoever he had to find, he would bring life back to this house. He would hear his daughter laugh again before another season passed, even if he had no idea how. 3 days later, Margaret Fletcher arrived at the ranch with her nephew in tow. She led the boy by the hand up the long drive, their dusty shoes marking each step. Thomas met them on the porch. The woman was perhaps 35, worn but carrying herself with quiet dignity. Her dress was mended but clean. The boy beside her looked about 6, with serious eyes that had seen too much. "Mr. Harrison," she said, "I'm Margaret Fletcher. I heard you might need household help." "I do," Thomas said. He studied her face, saw grief there he recognized too well. "What's your situation?" "Mrs. Fletcher." "I'm widowed 6 months now," she said without flinching. "My husband passed sudden, left debts I couldn't manage. Lost the house. My nephew Danny here lost both parents to fever last year. We've been staying with my sister-in-law, but she can't keep us long-term. Danny pressed against Margaret's side, silent and watchful. I can cook. Margaret continued. I can keep a good house. I'm offering straightforward work in exchange for shelter. A cottage if you have one. Or we'll make do with whatever space you can spare. Thomas nodded slowly, direct and honest. No games or pretense. He appreciated that. I have a cottage out back, he said. 2 rooms. Needs some fixing, but it's sound. He paused, considering his next words. But I have a condition. Mrs. Fletcher, an unusual one. Margaret's spine straightened slightly. I'm listening. My daughter hasn't laughed since her mother died. Thomas said. The words came harder than he expected. It's been a year. She's 8 years old and she's forgotten what joy sounds like. So yes, I need someone who can cook and keep house. But I also need someone who can bring joy back into this home. I dost tear. He watched Margaret's face shift surprise, then something deeper, understanding, maybe, or recognition. I'm not certain I've got any joy left to give, Mr. Harrison, she said quietly. I'm pretty broken myself these days. Then maybe we'll find it together. Thomas said, the job's yours if you want it. Either way. But that's what I'm really hiring for. Not just meals. Not just clean floor. I need someone who can help this house remember how to breathe. Margaret looked down at Danny, then back at Thomas. Through the window behind him, Emma appeared briefly at the top of the stairs, a small silent shadow. I'll try. Margaret said, that's all I can promise. I'll try. That's all any of us can do, Thomas said. They shook hands. Her grip was firm despite the calluses. An hour later, Margaret and Danny were settling into the cottage. It was small, but dry, with good light through the windows. Danny explored while Margaret unpacked their few belongings. In it dike by den. Aibdi. Will we stay here forever? Danny asked, touching the rough wooden walls with something like hope. Margaret folded one of his shirts, smoothing the fabric carefully. We'll see. Sweetheart. We'll see. Aye. Through the cottage window, she could see the main house. Somewhere inside was a grieving man and his silent daughter. She'd promised to bring joy to people who'd forgotten what it felt like. The weight of that promise settled over her shoulders like a yoke. She thought of her own laughter. How long it had been since she'd heard it. 6 months of survival. Of putting one foot ahead of the other. Of being strong for Danny when she felt hollowed out inside. But she'd made a promise. To Thomas Harrison. Yes. But also to herself when she decided to keep going after her husband died. She would live. Not just survive, but actually live, even if she had to relearn how. So, that evening, Margaret unpacked the last of her belongings. At the bottom of her bag, wrapped in cloth, she found her late husband's recipe book. She sat on the bed and opened it carefully. Her mother-in-law's handwriting filled the pages, recipes passed down through generations. In the margins, Margaret's husband had added notes in his familiar scrawl. Extra salt. He'd written next to the biscuit recipe. Ma always forgot. The memories rose like floodwater. James laughing in their kitchen. Flour on his shirt from trying to help. James fevered and failing. The illness taking him so fast she barely had time to understand what was happening. The creditors appearing after the funeral. Debts she'd never known existed. The house sold. Her things packed. Danny arriving on her doorstep, orphaned and terrified, needing her when she could barely stand. She'd promised Danny a home. Now she'd promised Thomas Harrison something even harder: the resurrection of joy from grief's ashes. Margaret closed the book and held it against her chest. "Yeah, help me," she whispered to James, to God, to anyone listening. "I don't know how to do this." Danny was already asleep in the smaller bed. Exhausted from the journey, Margaret watched him breathe. This child who'd lost everything but somehow still smiled sometimes. If he could find joy again, maybe she could too. She stood and walked to the main house. Thomas had given her a key. The kitchen was beautiful, larger than her entire cottage, with a wide hearth and a good stove and windows facing east to catch the morning light. But it was cold, unused, still arranged exactly as Sarah Harrison had left it. Margaret ran her hand along the counter. Dust had settled despite the ranch hand's attempts to keep things clean. This room wanted to be lived in. Wanted to hear the clatter of pots and the sizzle of cooking and voices talking about nothing important. Would sure de glorify. And on the shelf sat cookbooks, Sarah's collection. Margaret touched their spines gently, reverently. Another woman's legacy. "I'll do right by you," Margaret whispered to the silent room. "I promise." She moved to the stove and checked it. Good cast iron. Well maintained. She opened the damper and arranged kindling from the box. The match caught on the second strike. Flame bloomed in the firebox, warm and alive, the first fire in this kitchen in a year. Margaret fed it carefully. Watched it grow stronger. Light spilled across the floor. Heat began to radiate into the cold room. Outside the window, stars were appearing. A mockingbird sang its evening repertoire. Spring sounds, living sounds. Margaret took a deep breath. Tomorrow she would cook breakfast in this kitchen. The Astaya. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of bringing this house back to life. She didn't know if she could succeed, but standing there in the warming kitchen with firelight dancing on the walls, she felt something small and fragile unfurl inside her chest. Not quite hope, not yet. But maybe the memory of what hope felt like. The first 2 weeks passed in careful adjustment. Margaret rose before dawn and cooked breakfast simple food. Well made. Thomas and Emma ate with quiet appreciation, but few words. Danny tried to befriend Emma, but she retreated to her room each time he approached. Margaret kept respectful distance. She cleaned and cooked and spoke when spoken to, but didn't push. Trust took time. And these people had been wounded deep. The household staff warmed to her quickly. The ranch hands appreciated hot meals delivered on time. The stable manager brought her fresh eggs from the hen house. Even old Hank, the foreman, started lingering in the kitchen doorway for morning coffee. But Emma remained distant, silent, watching from doorways but never entering the kitchen. Margaret noticed everything. The way Emma's hands never got dirty. The way she moved through rooms like she was trying not to disturb the air. The way she looked at her father with those enormous, careful eyes. On the 10th day, Margaret started humming while she cooked. Nothing deliberate, just an old tune her mother used to sing. Danny looked up from the corner where he was playing with wooden blocks. "I know that one," he said. "Your mama used to sing it," Margaret said. "Want to learn the words?" Danny nodded eagerly. Margaret taught him. Her voice soft at first, then stronger. Danny's high. Clear voice joined hers. He got the words wrong and they laughed, trying again. The laughter floated through the house like something wild and unexpected. In his study, Thomas heard it. He stopped mid-sentence in the letter he was writing. The sound pierced him, both painful and precious. He closed his eyes, listening. Upstairs, Emma stood in the hallway. Her hand rested on the banister. Below, Margaret and Danny were singing about a mockingbird and a diamond ring, their voices tangling together in cheerful chaos. Emma's fingers tapped against the wood, almost keeping rhythm. Almost. Over the next few days. The singing continued. Margaret taught Danny silly songs from her own childhood. Germanai. He had no self-consciousness, no fear of being too loud. His laughter rang through the house like bells. Emma listened from her hiding places. The stairs, the hallway, once, from just outside the kitchen door. So close Margaret could have reached out and touched her. But Margaret didn't push. She just kept singing, kept cooking, kept filling the house with the sounds of living. Thomas watched it all from a distance. He saw Margaret's patience, her gentle persistence. He saw how she never forced anything, just created space for joy to grow if it wanted to. One evening, he found her in the kitchen after Emma had gone to bed. She was kneading dough for tomorrow's bread, her hands working with practiced rhythm. She listens, Margaret said without looking up. From the hallway. Every afternoon when Danny and I sing. I know, Thomas said. I don't know if it's helping. It is. Thomas leaned against the door frame. She taps her fingers, keeping time. I saw her do it yesterday. Margaret looked up, hope lighting her face. That's something. That's everything, Thomas said quietly. They stood in comfortable silence. The only sound, the soft thump of dough against the wooden board. Your wife, Margaret said carefully. She would have wanted this. Wouldn't she? For Emma? I mean, Thomas smiled. Sad but real. Sarah loved music. Loved laughter. She'd have had this kitchen full of noise and chaos. He paused. She would have liked you. Mrs. Fletcher, Margaret, she said. Please. Margaret, he repeated. And I'm Thomas when we're alone like this. The intimacy of first names hung between them for a moment. Then Margaret returned to her dough and Thomas to his study. But something had shifted, small and subtle, like the first crack in winter ice, on a warm afternoon in the third week. Margaret decided to make biscuits. Not just any biscuits, her mother-in-law's recipe, the one James had loved best. She pulled out the old recipe book and set it on the counter. Danny appeared at her elbow, curious. What are we making? Biscuits that spring back like little pillows when you touch them, Margaret said. Measuring flour. Want to help? Danny climbed onto a stool. Margaret showed him how to cut butter into flour, how to add just enough milk. The dough came together under their hands, soft and yielding. Press it, Margaret said. Gently. See how it bounces back. Danny pressed with one finger. The dough dimpled, then slowly returned to shape. He laughed with delight. Pressing again and again, their voices carried through the house. Margaret was teaching Danny a song about a frog who wouldn't jump when Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway. She stood frozen, half hidden by the frame. Margaret's heart jumped, but she kept her voice steady. Casual. Good afternoon, Emma, she said. We're making biscuits. Would you like to help us? These biscuits need gentle hands. And I think you have the gentlest hands in this house. Emma didn't move. Margaret held her breath, waiting, then. So slowly it almost hurt to watch. Emma stepped into the kitchen. Margaret wanted to weep, wanted to cheer. Instead, she smiled and pulled out another stool. Come see how the dough springs back, she said. Emma climbed up. Danny pressed the dough, and it bounced. Emma watched. Fascinated. Tentatively. She reached out one finger, pressed. Watched the dough return. A tiny smile ghosted across her face. They worked together, cutting biscuits with the rim of a glass. Flour dusted the counter. Their hands. Emma's dark dress. Margaret showed them how to place the biscuits just so on the baking sheet. Danny's elbow knocked the flour tin. It tipped. White powder spilled across the counter in a cloud. "Oh no," Danny said, then giggled as flour settled on his hair. Margaret laughed. "You look like an old man." Danny flicked flour at Emma, a small, playful gesture. A test. Emma froze. Margaret's breath stopped. Then Emma's hand moved. She flicked flour back. Powder hung in the air between them. Danny's eyes went wide. Then he grinned and flicked again. Emma responded. Within seconds, flour filled the air like snow, and Emma laughed. The sound was rusty, unpracticed, but real. It bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her, a year of silence finally breaking. She laughed and flicked flour, and Danny laughed with her. And Margaret stood there with tears streaming down her face, watching these two children rediscover joy in a cloud of white dust. The kitchen was a disaster. Flour. Everywhere counters. Floor. In their hair. On their clothes. It would take an hour to clean. Margaret had never seen anything more beautiful. That evening, Thomas found Margaret alone in the kitchen. She was scrubbing the last of the flour from the floorboards, her hair still dusted white. "I heard," he said quietly. She laughed. Margaret said, looking up at him, "Thomas." She laughed. "I know." His voice was thick. "Thank you." Margaret sat back on her heels. The joy of the afternoon was fading, leaving something harder in its wake. "I don't know if I can do this," she said. "I don't know if I can heal this house when I'm still so broken myself." Thomas crouched beside her. "Sarah would have loved you," he said. "Would have loved what you're doing for Emma. For all of us." "You said that before." "I meant it then, too." He paused. I'm starting to think maybe healing isn't something we do alone. Maybe we help each other find our way back." Margaret looked at him this kind. Grieving man who'd hired her not for her skills, but for her heart. Who'd been honest about his wounds from the very first day. "Maybe so," she whispered. Outside, night was falling. Inside, two children slept peacefully in their beds, and in the kitchen, two broken people sat in the flour dust and dared to hope they might be finding their way home. Brusau Bay. Emma's grandmother arrived unannounced on a Thursday afternoon. Her carriage rolled up the drive with the weight of judgment. "Wais for car." Margaret was in the kitchen making bread when she heard the commotion. "You know fa me." Through the window, she saw Thomas helping an imposing older woman down from the carriage. The woman's face was carved from disapproval. "That'll be Mrs. Harrison Sr.," Hank muttered, passing by with a load of firewood. Sarah's mother-in-law. Wasn't fond of Sarah, neither. Margaret's stomach tightened. She wiped her hands on her apron and tried to look busy. Mrs. Harrison swept through the house like a cold wind. Emma, who'd been helping Danny build a tower from wooden blocks in the parlor, immediately went still, the careful, silent version of herself sliding back into place. Margaret heard the older woman's voice carrying through the house. "Thomas, we need to discuss the child's upbringing. This neglect cannot continue." 20 minutes later, Mrs. Harrison appeared in the kitchen doorway. Her eyes swept the room, the flour still faintly visible in the corners from yesterday's biscuit making. the children's laughter still echoing in the walls. "So this is where the chaos originates," she said. Margaret straightened. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Margaret Fletcher, the housekeeper." "I see." Mrs. Harrison's gaze was sharp as broken glass. And is this what passes for proper household management, now allowing children to run wild in the ice kitchen?" "The children were helping me bake," Margaret said evenly. "Learning useful skills. Learning to make a mess. You mean—" Mrs. Harrison stepped closer. "Thomas may have been fooled by your situation, but I know opportunism when I see it. A widow with a child to support, worming her way into a grieving man's household." Margaret's face burned, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm employed to cook and manage the house, ma'am. Nothing more." "We'll see." Mrs. Harrison turned to leave, then paused. "Sarah was a lady. She ran this house with dignity and order. I expect my granddaughter to be raised with the same standards, not playing servants' games in the kitchen." That evening, Margaret heard raised voices from Thomas's study. Mrs. Harrison's words cut through the walls. "Shikai, you dishonor my son's wife by replacing her so quickly with this woman. Sarah deserved better than to be forgotten within a year." "Mother, that's not what's happening. Isn't it a strange woman cooking in Sarah's kitchen?" Playing mother to Emma. "How long before you install her in Sarah's bedroom as well?" Silence. Then Thomas's voice, quieter, uncertain. "You're being unfair." Am I the only one willing to protect Sarah's memory?" Margaret pressed her hands against the cottage table, her vision blurred with tears. Was the old woman right? Was she dishonoring Sarah's memory by bringing laughter back too soon that night? Emma didn't come to the kitchen. She ate dinner in her room. Silent again, Margaret tried to coax her out, but the child wouldn't even look at her. Danny noticed. "Oh, why won't Emma play anymore?" Margaret had no answer. She lay awake that night, staring at the cottage ceiling. Maybe she'd been presumptuous. Maybe grief needed more time, more respect. Maybe joy was a betrayal when the dead were still so freshly mourned. By dawn, she'd made her decision. She would leave, find other work. Spare this household the conflict her presence created. She began mentally packing, sorting what they'd need for the road. Danny would be confused, hurt, but better that than watching Emma retreat back into silence because of her. Margaret sat at the small table and put her head in her hands. She'd failed again, just like she'd failed to save James, failed to keep their home, failed to protect Danny from loss. Some people weren't meant to build new things. Some people just carried ruins wherever they went. The sun was barely up when Margaret heard a soft knock on the cottage door. She opened it to find Emma standing there in her nightgown, clutching a handful of wildflowers. "Please don't go," Emma whispered. Margaret's breath caught. "Sweetheart. How did you—" "I heard you crying last night. I saw you packing through the window." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Please don't leave. It's my fault. I'll be quiet again. I'll be good. Just don't go." Margaret dropped to her knees, taking Emma's small hands in hers. "Oh, honey, no. You didn't do anything wrong. Grandmother said laughing means I'm forgetting Mama." Emma said. The words tumbled out desperately. She said good girls don't make noise and mess. She said you're taking Mama's place. And that's wrong. "Emma, listen to me." Margaret held her gently. "Your grandmother is scared. She's scared of losing your mother's memory. But sweetheart, healing isn't forgetting. It's not—" "No." Margaret brushed hair from Emma's face. Your mama lives on in every moment you choose joy. She lives in your laughter, in your kindness, in all the love you have to give. Healing honors her by letting you live the full, beautiful life she wanted for you. Emma's tears spilled over. I miss her so much. I know. I miss my James too. Margaret's own tears fell. But I'm learning something. Emma, the people we love don't want us to stop living. They want us to carry their love forward into everything we do. Emma threw her arms around Margaret's neck. They held each other in the doorway, while the sun climbed higher, and the mockingbirds sang their morning songs. Footsteps on the path. Thomas approached, his face drawn with worry. He stopped when he saw them. Emma told me she was coming to find you. He said quietly, I'm sorry. I should have stopped my mother-in-law sooner, should have defended you better. Margaret stood, keeping one arm around Emma. You're in a hard position. No, Thomas said firmly. Not anymore. This is my household, my family, and you. He looked at Margaret. You've brought my daughter back to life. I won't let anyone take that away from us. He knelt beside Emma. Your grandmother loves you, sweetheart, but she's wrong about this. Margaret isn't replacing your mother. Nobody could, but she's helping us heal, helping us learn to live again. And that's exactly what your mama would have wanted. Emma nodded, wiping her eyes. Can I still help make biscuits? Every single day if you want to, Thomas said. Smiling, Emma looked at Margaret. And you'll stay. Margaret glanced at Thomas, saw the hope and determination in his face, saw Emma's small hand gripping her skirt, felt something shift inside her chest, not just hope now, but certainty. I'll stay, she said. This is home. Thomas stood and faced Margaret. My mother-in-law left early this morning. I made it clear her opinions no longer govern this house. He paused, something vulnerable in his expression. You've brought my daughter back, Margaret. But more than that, you've reminded me what it means to live instead of just existing. I don't know what I'm asking for here, but I know I want you to stay, not just as the housekeeper. As part of this family. Margaret felt Danny emerge from the cottage behind her, felt Emma's hand in hers, looked at Thomas and saw the future, taking shape between them, not perfect, not without grief's shadows, but real and possible, and full of growing things. We'll figure it out together, she said softly. All of us. Thomas reached out and took her free hand. 4 people standing in the morning light, making a family from fragments and hope. The wildflowers Emma had picked were crushed between them, their scent rising sweet and strong in the warming day. Sunday arrived with clear skies and the scent of summer on the wind. Margaret woke early and decided to make a feast. Not just any meal. A celebration. A thanksgiving for the healing that had begun. For the joy returning to this house like birds after a long winter. She enlisted both children immediately. Emma and Danny tumbled into the kitchen, eager and loud. Thomas followed, drawn by the commotion. We're making a proper Sunday dinner, Margaret announced, and everyone helps. She put Danny to snapping beans, showed Emma how to measure flour for cornbread. Thomas hesitated in the doorway, uncertain of his place in this domestic chaos. Don't just stand there, Margaret said, smiling. Peel those potatoes. Thomas sat at the table, awkward at first with the knife and the simple task. But Emma giggled at his clumsy peeling and he relaxed, let himself be part of the mess and noise. Margaret taught them a song while they worked. Danny sang loudest, getting half the words wrong. Emma corrected him. laughing. Thomas hummed along, his deep voice anchoring their lighter ones. The kitchen filled with warmth and the smell of cooking, flour-dusted surfaces again. Potato peels overflowed the bowl. Danny spilled water, and Emma helped him clean it up without being asked. They were learning to be a family, learning the rhythm of working together, of laughter shared over small tasks, of grace given for mistakes. Margaret moved between them, conducting this symphony of ordinary moments. She showed Emma how to test cornbread with a toothpick, let Danny taste the beans, and declare them perfect. Wechini Warwelles caught Thomas's eye across the table and felt her heart expand, with something she thought was lost forever. Aunt Margaret, Emma said suddenly, naturally, reaching for the flour. Nay, can I add the sugar? The room went still. Aunt Margaret. The title hung in the air like something precious and fragile. Margaret's eyes filled. Of course, sweetheart. Emma measured carefully, her face serious with concentration. Danny bounced on his stool, excited to add his ingredient next. Thomas watched his daughter flour-dusted, laughing, calling this woman aunt, and something broke open in his chest. He stood abruptly and walked to the hallway. Margaret saw him go, saw his shoulders shaking. She followed, found him leaning against the wall with his face in his hands. Tears ran between his fingers. Thomas, she said softly. She called you aunt. He managed. She's laughing, making a mess. Being a child again. His voice broke. I never thought I was so afraid. Margaret took his hands, pulled them gently from his face. I know. For a year I watched her disappear, watched the light go out of her. I would have given anything, everything, to hear her laugh like that again. She's healing, Margaret said. You both are. Thomas looked at her with raw honesty. I was afraid that letting joy back in meant forgetting Sarah, meant dishonoring what we had. Love doesn't replace love, Thomas, Margaret said, echoing words she'd spoken to Emma. It expands to hold everyone who matters. Sarah will always be Emma's mother, always be your first love. But there's room for more, room for healing, room for new love, growing alongside the old. She held his gaze. Let him see what she was offering. Not replacement. Not erasure of the past. But possibility, future, a chance to build something new while honoring everything that came before. Thomas pulled her close, buried his face in her hair. She held him, while he wept for Sarah. For the year of grief. For Emma's laughter finally restored. For the terrifying hope of loving again. From the kitchen, they heard Emma teaching Danny the song, their voices tangling together in joyful chaos. That's the sound of home, Thomas whispered. Margaret nodded against his shoulder. Yes, that's exactly what it is. 3 months later, full summer had arrived in the valley. The Harrison ranch bloomed with heat and green growing things. The kitchen had become the heart of the household in ways Margaret never imagined. Morning biscuits were a ritual now, with Emma helping measure and Danny testing the dough's spring. Afternoons brought reading lessons at the big table. Evenings meant stories and laughter and the comfortable chaos of family. Emma thrived like a plant finally given proper sun. She'd gained weight, lost the careful stillness that had defined her grief. She ran. She played. She argued with Danny over small things and made up just as quickly. She was 8 years old again, fully and beautifully. Danny had found his forever home. He called Thomas Sir, and Margaret Mama, and Emma Sister, without anyone correcting him. This was his family now, certain and complete. Thomas and Margaret's relationship had deepened slowly, respectfully. They were taking their time, honoring both the past and the tender new thing growing between them. But everyone on the ranch saw how he looked at her, how she smiled when he entered a room, how they'd built something lasting from shared grief and intentional joy. On this particular Sunday, Margaret had invited the ranch hands to join them for dinner. The big table was expanded with boards and sawhorses. Laden with platters of food, Hank the foreman sat next to the stable manager. It's esto. The bunkhouse cook had come. Grateful for a meal he didn't have to prepare. Danny and Emma sat together, whispering and giggling. Thomas sat at one end of the table, Margaret at the other. Their eyes meeting across the gathered family. The windows stood open to summer breeze. Curtains lifted and fell with each breath of wind. On the shelf, Emma's music box played softly, not a shrine anymore, but a treasured memory woven into daily life. Emma stood up, suddenly shy, but determined. I want to tell a joke. Everyone quieted, waiting. Thomas's hand tightened on his glass. Why did the chicken cross the road? Emma asked, then giggled before she could deliver the punchline. Oh, why? Danny demanded. To get to the other side. Emma dissolved into laughter at her own joke. It wasn't funny. It was the oldest, simplest joke in the world, but everyone laughed anyway. Because Emma was telling it. Because joy had returned to this house. Because healing was real and visible and sitting right there at the table. Margaret served the biscuits. Passing the basket around, Danny took 3 and declared them seasoned with laughter. Just like Mr. Harrison said. Thomas smiled at Margaret. The best seasoning there is. Better than salt? Danny asked seriously. Better than anything, Thomas said, still looking at Margaret, after dinner. While the men helped clear dishes and the children played in the yard, Margaret stood at the kitchen window watching them. The house that had been so silent a few months ago now rang with life. Thomas came to stand beside her. I thank you, he said quietly. For what? For answering an impossible job posting. For staying when it got hard, for teaching us how to live again. Margaret leaned against him. Why, Kikar. You gave me a home when I had none. You let me be part of your healing, which helped me heal too. On through the window. They watched Emma teaching Danny to cartwheel. She fell and he laughed and she chased him across the grass, both shrieking with joy. Sarah would have loved this, Thomas said. I think she does love it. Margaret replied. Wherever she is, she sees her daughter thriving. That's what any mother wants. Thomas took Margaret's hand. I'm not ready to ask you what I want to ask you. Not yet. But someday soon. I know. Margaret said, squeezing his fingers. I'll wait. We're building something good here. He said, we are. She agreed. The narrative pulled back, the view widening through the open kitchen window. The ranch spread out under summer sun barn. Stables. Pastures full of horses. Hills rolling green toward distant mountains. And in the center, the main house with its open windows and full kitchen and laughter drifting across the land like seeds on the wind. A house that had been a memorial had become a home. A family shattered by loss had been rebuilt through patience and courage and the simple act of choosing joy. Even in grief's shadow, Margaret had arrived seeking shelter and had found a calling. Thomas had sought someone to cook and had found someone to love. Emma had been silent and had remembered her voice. Danny had been orphaned and had found his people. They'd all learned that healing doesn't dishonor the dead. It honors them. by continuing to live fully, by building communities that tend both practical and emotional needs, by creating space for hearts to mend together. As the sun lowered and the family gathered for evening prayers, the kitchen table held them all. Laughter seasoned everything they shared, the best seasoning there is. The kind that makes a house into a home and strangers into family. The mockingbirds sang in the cottonwoods. The breeze carried the scent of summer grass and distant rain. Inside, the Harrison household sat together in lamplight and love. Proof that joy and grief can coexist, that families can be rebuilt, that healing is possible when we tend each other with intentional care, and in the kitchen where it all began. Margaret's recipe book sat open on the shelf, its pages holding generations of wisdom about feeding both body and soul.